Part of it is that the same logic of punitive responses to social problems, in this case, alcohol abuse, right, um, is part of the culture of this moment. There are tough on crime folks who are trying to lock up as many of these kids in that moment too. I mean, that tension is always there. It's just that the good guys there are a lot of good guys and they're doing a lot of good work, but they don't care as much about black folks. That's the story. The story is not that they don't have enemies, but they carry the day. In the case of bootlegging in the Prohibition period, the scale of the problem of alcohol abuse, first, is so substantial that it produces a temperance movement that by the time of the 1920s, it's half a century old. I mean, alcohol is the source of the devil's delivery of sin in the world, is even older than that. But as a temperance movement, by the 1870s, you have white women who are organizing around ending alcohol abuse in the community. It culminates in the Prohibition period. But the immediate consequence of temperance, aka Prohibition, was to produce this gigantic underground economy. And that underground economy now incentivizes young white men to regulate the underground economy, not by suing people, not by price wars, but by violence. And so there's a lot of collateral damage. Like, we know the story. I mean, that's what's so freaking frustrating, right? Because we've seen it. We know the story. But here's what you don't know, is that in the midst of all of that, state legislatures, New York in particular, passes a whole bunch of laws. And they take effect in 1926, several years after Prohibition starts in 1921. And they are essentially designed to close all the loopholes in the criminal justice system so that people who are convicted of violence or crimes related to the Prohibition context will go to prison for as long as possible. So they passed mandatory minimum laws. And the most draconian of these was a four strikes law. Not unlike the wave of four strikes laws that get passed in this country in the 1990s, at the height of our violence epidemic and the war on drugs. The four strikes law was based on, and you can't look this up as easily, you have to go to law review database to find stuff, so I can't encourage you to go to Google on this, but you have to take my word for it for now. Although I did write an article in Souls called Where Did All the White Criminals Go? Published 2 years ago, so you can see my early take on this. Essentially, the four strikes law said anybody convicted of a fourth felony in the state of New York would go to prison for the rest of their life, period. No questions, no ifs, ands, or buts. You're done. And all those felonies could be non-violent property offenses, having nothing to do with hurting somebody. And it went into effect. And guess what happened? You had all these low-level offenders who were, the logic of the tough on crime response in New York was that the bad guys are, quote, literally getting away with murder. They're engaging in, they're holding up buses, and I'm just naming the headlines. They're holding up buses in broad daylight. There's shootouts on the corner. These fools are taking over the place. And then they have these high-priced lawyers who get them off. So the image of the modern gangster, their words, not mine, framed the reason, the justification for the law. But the people who were coming before judges, who were being sentenced under the law, were small fry, petty criminals at best. And so when they started to fill the docket of folks being charged as four-time felonies, facing mandatory life prison, you had habitual car thieves. You had folks who had, done things over the course of several years that, quote-unquote, broke the law, all property offenses. And then in the most recent instance, smashed a window to try to take a fur coat out of them. I mean, I'm not saying that they didn't make a choice to break the law. But the judges who were sentencing under this new law were apologizing to the defendants because the state legislature had made this insane law that they thought was unfair to the people. But part of the unfairness of it was why? Because they look like that. And they started seeing, like, we can't do this to these people. And then guess what happens? By 1929, the stock market crashes. And all of a sudden, the world looks like a very unfriendly place to poor people. And so the prisons start to fill up. They actually passed habitual offender laws, felony enhancement laws targeting the use of handguns in the commission of a crime. So essentially, if you got caught with a handgun and you arrested, your punishment was even stiffer. So this moment brings into existence this huge apparatus of tough on crime punitive responses. The targets of it are white. It's clearly understood as such. And what do you think happens after the stock market crashes? Prisons are filling up. There's riots in some prisons, unlike Pelican Bay. They rolled it back. The governor of New York at the time was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he and Eleanor started signing clemency petitions, hand over fist, because they don't, they read the newspaper and they're like, that person deserves to go to prison for the rest of their life. By 1932, the same law that came into existence because prohibition was so terrible and all this crime was happening, rescinded the law. And by 1937, it was almost completely off the books. And by 1933, prohibition was off the books. So what happens in a moment? We talk about white affirmative action. Well, even within the criminal justice system, big punishment was part of the process of criminalizing white folks in this age, and it was completely reversed. And the segue from big punishment was the New Deal. They tried big punishment. The progressives had not put in place the infrastructure to do big punishment. They had put in infrastructure to do differently. But part of the unintended consequence of the temperance movement, which itself was a progressive movement, was this overreaction. And because the victims of that overreaction were overwhelmingly white people, they said, too big to fail. We're going to bail them out, and we're going to legalize alcohol, and we're going to shut down this prison expansion. And so the rate of prisons, if you look, you can Google this. If you look at the rate of incarceration per capita in the United States, from 1925 roughly to 1970, it's a flat line. It's basically 125 per 100,000. In 1970, right at the moment where black folks are free at last again, right? Except there's no work. So this new form of freedom that unleashes all these pent-up social forces in society, the prison rate literally skyrockets.
And just to add to that, what comedian Richard Pryor said about black people, just us.
Right.
That was the justice.
Just us. Yeah.
Just us became part of that 1970 and beyond movement.
Yeah. No, he's brilliant. He's got a track called American History. I'm terrible at telling jokes, so I won't try to. That's fine. We should look it up.
Can you do one last analysis for me on what is black on black crime?
What is black on black crime? It's a epithet used to define violence within the black community as a cultural pathological symptom. So there's all violence is interracial, by and large. Very few black folks kill white folks, or commit violence against, and vice versa. The George Zimmermans are as exceptional as, you have, of course, will have a property theft or home invasion. But I think most of us in this room would agree that a home invasion of a young black youth breaking into a white home is really little to do with a form of racial victimization as so much as it has to do with wealth inequality. So black on black violence was invented in the 1980s. It's not actually anywhere in my research. There is a discourse in my research that ends in the 1930s of black people being their quote unquote their own worst enemies. And that is a catch-all for the bad decisions that they make and the harm that they do to each other. That does exist. But there is no discourse of black on black violence. It is an 80s construct. And it is a construct used to pathologize symptoms of violence in a community, which is not a call to what will you do to prevent it. It is a call to a punitive, tough on crime response. That this is evidence. It's Hoffman. It's the same story. It's just it has a particular political moment where it arrives because it is happening in the midst of the war on drugs and a post-civil rights moment. You don't really need the trope of black on black violence as long as segregation exists. because you need most of those people to be at work. So you know, it doesn't do any work for you, right? You need to be able to coerce and supervise black people en masse in the South because you need their bodies tilling the land. Or in the North, you need them to be an expendable labor force there to hold in check white labor, and then where white labor doesn't exist, to do the manual, dangerous, low-grade work in our factories. But once all that's been resolved by global economy, the black-on-black trope becomes a way of saying, we can't help these people. This is not about anything that we did. This is what they do to each other. That's not our problem. It's their problem to fix.
Everyone, let's give him a